Welcome to part 2 of the admin settings training. In this section, we're going to cover setting up the user groups. So first, let's discuss what user groups are. User groups allow you to group users and apply security settings to that group. So when you log into ProLender and you go into admin settings for the first time, you'll see several user groups that we've defaulted for you. You'll see the Everyone group, which is in bold, and that is actually going to apply security to all user groups. You'll also see an admin settings and an operations. Now, the only difference that we have set up between the two, between the administrators and operations, is operations doesn't have access to admin settings. So when you first log in and you add all of your users, you can assign them all to operations and just assign your administrators to the administrators group. Now, we recommend that you add additional groups so that you can customize your security based on the users. So here I've actually added a few. I have some set up for docs and funding or for a processor. I've got I can designate the underwriter as whether or not they're a junior underwriter or senior underwriter. So you'll really want to take some time and decide what areas of ProLender do you want to enable for your users and which areas you want to restrict their access. Now let's take a look at how you're actually going to add user groups. So to add a user group, you'll go up to Actions and click on Insert New User Group. And of course, you can always delete one. However, we also give you an option to copy a user group. So if you made some changes, maybe you set up security rights for a processor, and you wanted to copy those security rights to create another user group that maybe has some slightly different security. When you are sitting on that user group, you can go to Actions and click on Copy Selected User Group. So that's going to create a new user group. You can give it a new name and then adjust the settings however they need to be adjusted. So let's take a look at some of the security that you can set up. Now I'm going to be in the Everyone group. I'll hop back and forth a few times, but let's talk about for the Everyone group. When you first get ProLender, everything's going to be enabled. So keep in mind that you may want to disable some areas if you're not going to be using them. So let's take a look at some of the different things that you can set up security for. So here we have a list of items. You can set up or turn off different types of actions. So you know how I can go up to Actions and click on, insert a new user group or whatever it happens to be. When your user is actually working on a loan, they also have action item options. And so you can turn those off if you're not going to use them. So let's say, for example, calculate FHA premiums. I can disable that just by double-clicking on it. Or I can enable it for everyone just by double-clicking on Enable. And keep in mind we're in the Everyone group, so this is going to apply to all users. Now, if you want to enable it for most of your users, but maybe you want to restrict access to some of your users, you will enable it in the Everyone group and then go down to your individual user group and disable it for them. So let's say that I go, now that I am in my processor user group, I can go to Actions, go to the General Department, go to my loan information, double-click on Calculate FHA Premiums, and I can double-click on Disabled so that only the users assigned to this user group will not have access to that feature. And so this works the same way for all of the different options. So let's go back to our Everyone group. You can do this for fields. You can even make fields read-only. So here I can turn on my fields. I can enable them. But then if I want to disable them for a specific user group, I can come in here and I can change it to read-only. So maybe they can view the information, but they're not going to be able to change it. So I can completely disable it so they don't even see the information in there, or I can enable it so they have full access. They can change it. They can edit that field. Now they also have, let me save these changes. So back to our everyone group, the same applies to grids or menu items. So if you wanted to limit the access to admin settings, this is where you would do it. Now, a word of caution, you don't want to disable admin settings for the everyone group, because then that means that you won't even be able to log into admin settings. So you'll want this to be enabled in your everyone group, but then disable it for your other groups. So you'll always want the administrators to have access to your admin settings as well. But any of these other options, if your company isn't going to use them, you can disable them here, or you can enable them for most of your users and turn them off for some other users. You have access to set security up for reports, for individual screens, the individual screen tabs, and even tables. So there's really no limit to what you can turn off in using this security. And you can also set up, what fields are actually imported into the system. So you can choose your import type. So let's say we're using Calyx Point, for example. You can go through and determine what fields are actually going to be imported. So let's take a look at our loan amount. So I can choose whether to import it or do not import. I can even choose at what point I no longer want this field to be updated through an import. So you can import a loan into ProLender. Then you can also update that same loan if some changes were made in your LOS system. You can copy back over that information and replace the data that's in ProLender. However, you may decide that, well, once the loan is approved, if somebody tries to update from the LOS system, I don't want this particular field to be overridden. So you can choose at what point in the loan process, once the loan has an approved status, you no longer want that field to be updated. So you can set up security that way as well. When you are using Calyx Point, you also can choose or manage the actual field in Point that gets imported into the field in ProLender. So if you notice down here, this field, this number corresponds to the field ID number in Calyx Point. So you can be very specific on what information, what field in Calyx Point is being imported into the ProLender field. And you also can set up your work queues. So here we have a full list of work queues, and you can use the arrow buttons. I'm just going to click on all of them to make them available to all my users. Now, if I only want my users to see the work queues that apply to them, I can go into each of these user groups and just make sure that they only can see the work queues that apply to them. Now, business rules are only going to be set up in the everyone group because they apply to all users. So you'll see that there's quite a few business rules in this list. We can scroll down and see all of these. Now I can double click on one of these and I can see the description down at the bottom of the screen. So this is going to tell me when this business rule is going to trigger and display for the user. I can also decide whether or not it's just going to be a warning or a violation. So a warning is going to pop up on their screen. They'll be able to click close and continue working on the loan. If it's set up as a violation, then it's going to prevent them from saving. They won't be able to print docs. They won't be able to do anything until the issue is corrected. So keep that in mind when you're setting up business rules. Do you want it to be a warning or do you need it to be a violation? And you'll notice that some of these or a lot of these are actually grayed out. That means that they haven't been enabled. So to enable a business rule, just double click on it and then double click on disable no. And so once you go to the next one, you'll see that it is actually turned black. In this case, it's turned bold. But you can enable and disable the business rules as needed. Now, you can also set up the pre-doc and pre-funding checks. So here we have a list. Now, they work the same way. You can double-click on it. See the description down here at the bottom. You can decide what type of category it should be, whether it's just a standard check, maybe it's under warnings, or it requires a sign-off, or maybe it's a violation. You can also determine what type, whether it's going to show up just for pre-docs, just for funding, or maybe it needs to show up in both. And then, of course, you can always enable and disable them. Now let's take a look at dashboards. Now here I've enabled all of these dashboards for my users. Now dashboards are typically used by management, so you may want to restrict access to those to just people who are in the administrators user group, or maybe you have a management user group. So keep that in mind, that you may want to enable them for everyone and then disable them for the individual user groups who aren't going to be using them. Then we also have the Image Center section, where you can limit the actions a particular user group can do within Image Center. So within any of these, if you don't want users to email, or you don't want them to be able to remove an image, you can disable that feature. You can also restrict access to specific folders. So here they're all enabled for my Everyone group, but I can go into my individual user groups and disable some of my folders. So if I didn't want somebody to have access to the accounting folder, I could limit that as well. So that concludes part 2 of the admin settings training.